Hey guys, tonight we begin with the history of the 1985 Pittsburgh drug trials. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. There are stories that live in the margins of memory, tucked away like old photographs in dusty boxes, waiting for someone to lift the lid and let the light touch them again. The 1985 Pittsburgh drug trials is one such story, a tale that unfolds not with the crack of the bat or the roar of the crowd, but with the whisper of secrets exchanged in locker rooms, the rustle of white powder passed from hand to trembling hand, and the slow, inexorable unraveling of dreams that once seemed as solid as the steel this city was built upon. Picture, if you will, Pittsburgh in the early 1980s. The city still carried the weight of its industrial past in its bones, the three rivers converging like arteries feeding the heart of America's working soul. Here, where the Pirates had danced their way to World Series glory in 1979, where Willie Stargell's smile had lit up October nights and made believers of an entire city, something darker had begun to take root. It was subtle at first, like the first wisps of smoke before a fire, barely visible but already spreading through the corridors and clubhouses of America's pastime. The year 1985 arrived with the bitter cold that only Pittsburgh winters know how to deliver, and with it came revelations that would shake the very foundations of baseball itself. But this is not merely a story of scandal. It is a meditation on how the things we love most can sometimes harbor the very poison that destroys them. It is about the distance between heroes and human beings, between the mythology we create and the reality that lives beneath it. And, perhaps most of all, it is about how 7 men, neither famous nor wealthy, became the vessels through which baseball's darkest secrets would finally spill into the unforgiving light of day. Let us begin not with the trials themselves, but with the quiet moments that preceded them, with the ordinary Tuesday in early 1979, when a 25-year-old named Kevin Koch walked into Three Rivers Stadium for what he thought would be nothing more than a lark. The Pittsburgh Pirates were holding auditions for a new mascot, the Pirate Parrot, and Koch's friend had signed him up almost as a joke. He was a welder by trade, a softball player by passion, and a dreamer by nature. Standing there in the echoing caverns of the stadium, surrounded by aspiring entertainers and theater students, Koch could never have imagined that this moment would one day be examined under oath, dissected in federal courtrooms, and remembered as the beginning of one of baseball's greatest scandals. But that is how these stories begin, isn't it? Not with grand proclamations or obvious turning points, but with small decisions made on ordinary days by ordinary people who have no idea they are stepping onto a stage that history is already preparing. Koch got the job. For 6 years, from 1979 to 1985, he would be the man inside the green-feathered costume, dancing on dugout roofs, entertaining children, and becoming as much a part of Pirates baseball as the warning track or the infield dirt. He was beloved by fans, trusted by players, and granted the kind of access that comes with being part of the family. He could walk into locker rooms, share jokes with all-stars, and move through the intimate spaces of professional baseball like he belonged there. Because, in many ways, he did belong there. Alongside Koch in this unfolding drama was his childhood friend Dale Schiffman, a freelance photographer whose love for the game had opened doors that might have remained closed to others. Schiffman was 31 in 1985, a man who had once harbored his own dreams of playing professional baseball before settling into a life spent capturing the dreams of others through his camera lens. He had the kind of access that photographers prize: permission to roam the field during batting practice, to document the intimate moments before games, to be present in those liminal spaces where athletes transform from men into heroes. Schiffman was living his dream, he would later say. Running onto the field during batting practice, shagging fly balls in right field, hanging out with big league players as if he were one of them. It was a dream come true, except that dreams, when they come true, sometimes reveal themselves to be more fragile than we ever imagined. The city of Pittsburgh in the early 1980s was a place caught between worlds. The steel industry that had defined it for generations was beginning its long, slow death, and the city was searching for new ways to define itself. Baseball provided comfort, continuity, a link to better times when the Pirates had been champions and the future had seemed bright with possibility. But even as fans filled Three Rivers Stadium, hoping to recapture some of that 1979 magic, something else was filling the spaces behind the scenes, something that would ultimately prove more powerful than nostalgia or hope. Cocaine had arrived in Major League Baseball, not with fanfare or announcement, but the way fog rolls in from a river, gradually, quietly, until suddenly you realize you can no longer see where you're going. By the early 1980s, it had become what one player would later describe as the all-American drug, a substance that promised energy, confidence, and escape from the pressures that came with playing a child's game for adult stakes in front of thousands of watching eyes. For the players, cocaine offered something that batting practice and spring training could not: a way to feel invincible. In a sport where a failure is built into the very fabric of success, where a .300 hitter fails 7 times out of 10, where even the best relievers sometimes watch their carefully crafted leads disappear into the night, cocaine whispered promises of perfection, of power, of the kind of confidence that could transform an ordinary man into a superhero. But cocaine is a liar, and its promises are written in disappearing ink. The Pittsburgh Pirates of the early 1980s were a team in decline, their 1979 championship already feeling like ancient history. By 1985, they would lose 104 games, drawing an average of just over 9,000 fans to Three Rivers Stadium, a cavernous venue that seemed to swallow what little enthusiasm remained in the Steel City. The team was struggling, the city was changing, and in the spaces between what was and what might have been, something dark was taking root. It began, as these things often do, with friendship. Players approaching people they trusted, asking casual questions about availability, about connections, about whether someone might know someone who could help with a particular kind of problem. Dale Schiffman would later recall how it started for him. It was one of those deals where they'd say, "Hey man, can you get us some Coke?" So I just started checking around, and before I knew it, things went from 0 to 60 real quick. 0 to 60. Like a car accelerating into traffic, like a pitcher's fastball, like the speed at which a life can change direction without any dramatic moment to mark the transition. One day, you're a photographer taking pictures of your heroes, and the next day, you're taking phone calls about quantities and prices, about meeting places and payment schedules, about things that have nothing to do with baseball and everything to do with the hunger that lives in the spaces between public performance and private need. Schiffman wasn't alone in this transformation. Kevin Koch, the man behind the Pirate Parrot, had found himself drawn into the same web of favors and friendships that seemed to bind the baseball world together. Neither man was a drug dealer in any traditional sense. They weren't hardened criminals or career narcotics traffickers. They were fans, really. Fans who had been granted access to their heroes and who discovered that their heroes had needs that went beyond autographs and admiration. The web of connections that would eventually be revealed in federal court was intricate and surprisingly extensive. There was Curtis Strong, a 39-year-old caterer from Philadelphia who had worked in the Phillies clubhouse and had parlayed that access into relationships with players across the league. Strong was described by prosecutors as the central figure in the distribution network, a man who used his catering work to move freely through the restricted areas of major league stadiums, carrying with him substances that had nothing to do with nutrition. Then there was Robert Rav McHugh, a former Easter Seals Society employee from Upper St. Clair, Pennsylvania, who had somehow found his way into the orbit of Pirates players. McHugh was older, more established than the others, but no less caught up in the gravitational pull of easy money and reflected fame that came with being connected to professional athletes. These men, Strong, McHugh, Schiffman, Koch, and 3 others who would eventually be indicted, were not master criminals. They were, in many ways, just fans who had stumbled into a world where the line between admiration and exploitation had become dangerously blurred. They were middle-aged men with ordinary jobs and extraordinary access, and they had discovered that access could be monetized in ways that had nothing to do with baseball cards or merchandise. The players themselves were a constellation of familiar names, men whose baseball cards had been treasured by children, whose statistics had been memorized and debated in barbershops and bars across America. There was Dave Parker, the powerful right fielder who had been the National League MVP in 1978, a man whose swing was as smooth as silk and whose presence in the batter's box could change the entire rhythm of a game. Parker was playing for the Cincinnati Reds by 1985, having left Pittsburgh amid whispers and rumors that wouldn't be confirmed until he found himself sitting in a federal courtroom, explaining under oath how he had come to know Curtis Strong. Keith Hernandez was there too, the elegant first baseman whose defense was poetry in motion and whose batting eye was legendary throughout the National League. Hernandez was with the New York Mets by the time the trials began, helping to lead them toward what would become a world championship in 1986. But his past had followed him east, and now he sat in a witness chair describing his relationship with cocaine with the same careful precision he had once used to turn double plays. Tim Raines, the electric leadoff hitter for the Montreal Expos, would testify about carrying cocaine in his uniform pocket during games, about sliding headfirst into bases, not for strategic reasons, but to protect the vial of white powder that rode with him around the base paths. The image is almost impossible to reconcile with the joy and abandon that characterized Raines as a player. This man who could steal bases like he was taking candy from children, who could turn singles into doubles with his speed alone, carrying his addiction with him as he danced between the foul lines. Dale Berra, son of the great Yogi Berra, found himself explaining to prosecutors and defense attorneys how he had obtained amphetamines from teammates Willie Stargell and Bill Madlock, how the use of greenies was so common on the Pirates that he didn't see anything wrong with it. The irony was sharp and painful. Here was the son of one of baseball's most beloved figures, a man whose father had become synonymous with the game's wisdom and wit, admitting to drug use that threatened to tarnish not just his own legacy, but the institution his father had helped to build. John Milner, the former first baseman who had played for both the Pirates and the New York Mets, created one of the trial's most stunning moments when he testified that he had found liquid amphetamines, red juice as it was called, in Willie Mays' locker. The revelation sent shockwaves through the baseball world, not because Mays was accused of using the substance, but because the suggestion that even the Say Hey kid, perhaps the most naturally gifted player in the game's history, had been somehow connected to performance-enhancing drugs challenged every assumption about purity and talent that fans had cherished for decades. The stories that emerged from the testimonies painted a picture of a baseball culture that was far different from what the public had imagined. Players testified about buying cocaine in bathroom stalls at Three Rivers Stadium during games, about dealers who had free access to locker rooms, about a level of drug use that Keith Hernandez estimated might have included as much as 40% of all major league players in the early 1980s. Though Hernandez would later try to walk back that estimate, saying he might have been grossly wrong, the number hung in the air like smoke, impossible to disperse completely. Rod Scurry, the Pirates' reliever whose curveball had once been considered among the best in the National League, emerged as perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire scandal. Testimony revealed that Scurry had once left the stadium during the late innings of a Pirates game to search for cocaine, abandoning his team and his responsibilities in pursuit of a high that had become more important than baseball itself. Scurry's story would not end with the trials. He would die of a cocaine-related heart attack in 1992, at just 36 years old. A stark reminder that this was not just a legal problem or a public relations crisis, but a matter of life and death. The investigation that led to the trials had begun in typical fashion, with rumors, whispers, and the kind of suspicions that eventually find their way to the right ears. The FBI had been tracking drug activity in and around Pittsburgh for months, following leads and developing sources, slowly building a case that would eventually stretch from the Steel City to Philadelphia and beyond. They had wiretaps and surveillance, undercover operations and informants, all the tools of modern law enforcement brought to bear on what was, in many ways, a very old story about temptation and weakness and the price of fame. The breakthrough had come when Kevin Koch, facing the prospect of serious federal charges, agreed to cooperate with authorities. In a parking lot in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, FBI agents strapped a wire to the chest of the man who had entertained thousands of children as the Pirate Parrot, and sent him to record conversations with his childhood friend Dale Schiffman. The image is almost too painful to contemplate. Koch, still young enough to remember when he and Schiffman had been teammates on softball fields, now transformed into an instrument of federal law enforcement, betraying a friendship that had lasted since high school in order to save himself from prison. But perhaps betrayal is too strong a word, because by the time Koch made his deal with the FBI, the friendship had already been corroded by drugs and money, and the kind of secrets that make intimacy impossible. The boy who had once pitched batting practice to the Pittsburgh Pirates, who had dreamed of playing professional baseball himself, was now wearing a wire to record his friend admitting to federal crimes. It was a transformation that seemed to encapsulate everything that had gone wrong, not just with these particular men, but with the entire culture that had made their crimes possible. The trials themselves began in the autumn of 1985, a season when baseball was celebrating some of its most cherished moments. Pete Rose was chasing Ty Cobb's all-time hit record. Phil Niekro and Tom Seaver were pursuing their 300th career victories, and the game seemed to be writing new chapters in its ongoing story of individual achievement and collective joy. But in a federal courtroom in Pittsburgh, a different story was being told, one that challenged every assumption about what professional baseball had become. The prosecuting attorneys painted a picture of corruption that went to the very heart of America's pastime. They described a world where drug dealers had free access to locker rooms, where players used cocaine during games, where the line between entertainment and addiction had been erased so completely that no one seemed to remember where it had been drawn in the first place. This was not just about individual failures or personal weaknesses. This was about institutional blindness, about a sport that had been so focused on protecting its image that it had failed to protect its players. The defense attorneys, led by the flamboyant Adam Renfro, took a different approach. They portrayed their clients as victims of celebrity culture, ordinary men who had been corrupted by their proximity to fame and fortune. Renfro called the testifying players hero criminals, men who were using their immunity agreements to make scapegoats of people who had simply been trying to help them. Strong, Renfro argued, was not a drug dealer but a baseball groupie, a man whose love of the game had been exploited by players who needed someone to blame for their own addictions. The strategy was compelling, but it ultimately failed to convince the jury. On September 20th, 1985, Curtis Strong was convicted on 11 counts of cocaine distribution. Robert McHugh would follow, convicted on 7 counts. Dale Schiffman, facing 111 counts, would eventually plead guilty to 20 and receive a 12-year sentence. The other defendants, Kevin Connolly, Thomas Balzer, Shelby Greer, and Jeffrey Moscow, would also be convicted or plead guilty, receiving sentences ranging from 13 months to 12 years. But the legal consequences for the dealers were only the beginning of the story. The real drama was yet to come, as Major League Baseball grappled with what to do about the players who had testified under immunity. Commissioner Peter Ueberroth found himself in an impossible position. He had players who had admitted to federal crimes but who could not be prosecuted because of their immunity agreements. How do you punish someone for something they've already been forgiven for? How do you maintain the integrity of your sport when that integrity has been shattered by the very people who were supposed to embody it? Ueberroth's response came on February 28, 1986, when he announced suspensions for 11 players. The suspensions ranged from a full season for 7 players who were deemed to have been prolonged drug users who had also facilitated distribution to other players, to shorter penalties for those who were considered to have been less involved. But almost immediately, Ueberroth commuted all the suspensions in exchange for fines, community service, and agreement to random drug testing. The players were allowed to continue their careers under the condition that they donate 10% of their base salaries to drug abuse programs, submit to random drug testing for the remainder of their careers, and contribute 100 hours of drug-related community service. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, tough enough to send a message about the seriousness of the problem, but lenient enough to avoid destroying careers and lives. The aftermath of the trials rippled through baseball in ways that are still being felt today. Some of the players involved, Dave Parker, Keith Hernandez, Lonnie Smith, were able to rebuild their careers and achieve new levels of success. Parker signed with the Cincinnati Reds and made the All-Star team 3 times after the scandal. Hernandez continued his consecutive Gold Glove streak through 1988 and helped lead the Mets to a World Championship. Smith won the National League Comeback Player of the Year award in 1989 with the Atlanta Braves. But others were not so fortunate. Rod Scurry's death in 1992 was a reminder that the legal proceedings had not solved the underlying problems that had led to the scandal in the first place. Willie Aikens was convicted of selling crack cocaine in 1994 and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Alan Wiggins died in 1991 after contracting HIV through intravenous drug use. The human cost of the scandal extended far beyond the courtroom and the baseball diamond. Perhaps most significantly, the Pittsburgh drug trials marked the beginning of a new era in baseball's relationship with drugs and performance enhancement. The scandal had exposed the inadequacy of the sport's existing policies and the naivety of its leadership about the realities of modern athletic culture. The trials were a wake-up call that forced baseball to confront uncomfortable truths about what its players were doing and what the sport needed to do to protect both its integrity and its participants. But even as baseball implemented new drug testing policies and educational programs, the fundamental questions raised by the Pittsburgh trials remained unanswered. How do you balance the public's need for heroes with the players' right to privacy? How do you maintain the mythology of sport while acknowledging the humanity of athletes? How do you protect a game that depends on performance from substances that enhance performance? These questions would become even more pressing in the decades that followed, as baseball grappled with the steroid era and the ongoing challenges of performance-enhancing drugs. The Pittsburgh drug trials can be seen as a precursor to those later scandals, a first glimpse of how the intersection of drugs and professional sports would continue to challenge our assumptions about competition, fairness, and the nature of athletic achievement. Looking back now, from the distance of 40 years, the Pittsburgh drug trials feel like a fever dream, a moment when the carefully maintained separation between public performance and private life collapsed completely. The testimonies given in those Pittsburgh courtrooms revealed a world that fans had never imagined. A world where their heroes carried cocaine in their uniforms, where drug dealers walked freely through locker rooms, where the game they loved was being played by men who were struggling with addictions that threatened to destroy everything they had worked to achieve. But perhaps that revelation was necessary. Perhaps it was time for baseball to confront the reality of what it had become. To acknowledge that the men who played the game were human beings with human weaknesses, and that those weaknesses could not be ignored or wished away simply because they were inconvenient to the mythology that surrounded the sport. The trials also revealed the complex web of relationships that surrounded professional baseball, the way that access and proximity could corrupt even the most innocent connections. Dale Schiffman and Kevin Koch had not set out to become drug dealers. They had simply been fans who loved the game and who had been granted unusual access to their heroes. But that access had transformed them, slowly and almost imperceptibly, until they found themselves at the center of a federal investigation, their friendship destroyed, and their lives forever changed. In many ways, their story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of hero worship, about what happens when the line between admiration and exploitation becomes blurred beyond recognition. They had wanted to be close to greatness, to be part of something larger than themselves, and they had discovered that greatness could be just as corruptible as anything else. The players, too, had been transformed by their experiences, forced to confront the gap between their public personas and their private struggles. Keith Hernandez, Dave Parker, Tim Raines, and the others who testified had been heroes to millions of fans, men whose athletic abilities had provided joy and inspiration to countless people. But they were also human beings who had made mistakes, who had succumbed to temptations that were more powerful than their talent or their will. Their testimonies in those Pittsburgh courtrooms were acts of courage as much as they were admissions of guilt. They could have remained silent, could have refused to cooperate with authorities, could have protected their images and their careers at the expense of justice. Instead, they chose to tell the truth, even when that truth was painful and embarrassing and potentially damaging to everything they had worked to build. That willingness to confront the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, may have been the most important legacy of the Pittsburgh drug trials. The scandal forced baseball to acknowledge that it had a problem, and that acknowledgement was the first step toward addressing it. The drug testing policies and educational programs that followed the trials were imperfect and incomplete. But they represented a recognition that the sport could not simply pretend that drugs were not a part of its reality. The trials also had implications that extended far beyond baseball. They came at a time when American society was beginning to grapple seriously with drug abuse, when the war on drugs was reshaping law enforcement and social policy, when the consequences of addiction were becoming impossible to ignore. The sight of famous athletes admitting to drug use under oath served as a powerful reminder that addiction did not respect fame or fortune, that it could affect anyone regardless of their status or achievements. In that sense, the Pittsburgh drug trials were both a baseball story and an American story, a reflection of broader cultural anxieties about drugs, about celebrity, about the relationship between public success and private failure. The trials revealed not just the problems within baseball, but the problems within a society that had created impossible pressures for its public figures, while providing them with insufficient support for dealing with those pressures. As we look back on the Pittsburgh drug trials from the vantage point of 2025, it is tempting to see them as a relic of a different era, a problem that baseball has long since solved. But that would be a mistake. The fundamental issues that led to the scandal, the pressure to perform, the availability of substances that promise to enhance performance, the complex relationship between public figures and those who seek to profit from their fame, remain as relevant today as they were 40 years ago. The specific drugs may have changed, the testing methods may have improved, and the penalties may have become more severe, but the underlying human dynamics remain the same. Athletes still face enormous pressure to succeed. Fans still invest their emotions and their identities in the performance of their heroes, and there will always be people willing to exploit those relationships for personal gain. What has changed, perhaps, is our understanding of these dynamics. The Pittsburgh drug trials helped to strip away some of the innocence that had surrounded professional sports, forcing fans and officials alike to confront the reality that their heroes were human beings with human flaws. That loss of innocence was painful, but it was also necessary, because it allowed for more honest conversations about the challenges facing modern athletes and the responsibilities of those who profit from their performances. The trials also demonstrated the importance of accountability, both for athletes and for the institutions that govern them. The players who testified in Pittsburgh were held accountable for their actions, even if the legal consequences were mitigated by their cooperation with authorities. Major League Baseball was held accountable for its failure to address drug abuse within its ranks, and was forced to implement new policies and procedures to prevent similar scandals in the future. That accountability was not perfect. Some would argue that the punishments were too lenient, that the reforms were too limited, that the lessons were not learned completely. But it was a start, and it established precedents that would influence how baseball and other sports would handle similar crises in the years to come. The Pittsburgh drug trials also highlighted the human cost of scandal, the way that public disgrace can destroy not just careers, but lives. Rod Scurry's death from a cocaine-related heart attack 7 years after the trials was a stark reminder that the consequences of addiction extend far beyond legal proceedings and professional punishments. Willie Aikens' subsequent conviction and imprisonment showed how drug abuse could continue to destroy lives even after the initial scandal had faded from public memory. These tragedies serve as a counterpoint to the more positive outcomes experienced by players like Dave Parker and Keith Hernandez, who were able to rebuild their careers and achieve new success after the trials. They remind us that recovery is not guaranteed, that the support systems that help some people overcome addiction are not available to everyone, and that the consequences of drug abuse can be permanent and irreversible. The trials also revealed the complex moral landscape that surrounds professional sports, the way that our desire for entertainment and our need for heroes can create ethical blind spots that allow abuse to flourish. The fans who packed Three Rivers Stadium throughout the early 1980s, cheering for players who were struggling with serious addictions, were not complicit in those players' problems, but their adulation and their financial support helped to create an environment where those problems could be hidden and ignored. This is not to suggest that fans bear responsibility for the choices made by athletes, but rather to acknowledge that the relationship between performer and audience is more complex than it might initially appear. The pressure to maintain heroic personas in the face of personal struggles is real, and it can prevent athletes from seeking the help they need when they need it most. The Pittsburgh drug trials forced a reckoning with these complexities, challenging fans to think more critically about their expectations of athletes and their willingness to ignore warning signs in pursuit of entertainment. It was an uncomfortable conversation, but it was also a necessary one, because it helped to establish new norms around transparency and accountability that would make it harder for similar problems to be hidden in the future. As we consider the legacy of the Pittsburgh drug trials, it is important to remember that they were not just about baseball or even just about drugs. They were about power and corruption, about the ways that institutions can fail the people they are supposed to protect, about the human capacity for both self-destruction and redemption. They were about the price of fame and the cost of silence, about the difference between heroes and human beings, about the sometimes painful process of learning to tell the truth. The men who found themselves at the center of the trials, the players who testified, the dealers who were convicted, the officials who were forced to respond, all paid prices for their involvement that extended far beyond anything that was mandated by law or regulation. Some lost careers, some lost friendships, some lost their lives. But some also found redemption, found ways to turn their mistakes into lessons that could help others avoid similar pitfalls. Dale Schiffman, who served 2 years in federal prison for his role in the drug distribution network, would later speak about finding faith during his incarceration and about his efforts to help others struggling with addiction. His transformation from drug dealer to drug counselor represents one of the more hopeful aspects of the entire story. A reminder that even the darkest chapters in our lives can lead to positive change if we are willing to learn from our mistakes. Kevin Koch, who avoided prison by cooperating with authorities, has spoken publicly about the choices he made and the regrets he carries. His willingness to discuss his role in the scandal, rather than simply trying to forget it, has provided valuable insights into how ordinary people can find themselves involved in extraordinary crimes. The players who testified have had varied experiences in dealing with the aftermath of the trials. Some, like Keith Hernandez, have been open about their past drug use and have used their experiences to educate others about the dangers of addiction. Others have been more private about their involvement, preferring to let their post-scandal achievements speak for themselves. What unites all of them is the recognition that the Pittsburgh drug trials represented a turning point, not just in their own lives, but in the life of baseball itself. The sport that emerged from the scandal was different from the one that had entered it, more aware of its vulnerabilities, more proactive in addressing potential problems, more honest about the challenges facing modern athletes. That transformation was not complete or perfect, and subsequent scandals would reveal that baseball still had work to do in addressing issues related to performance enhancement and athlete welfare. But the Pittsburgh drug trials had established important precedents about the need for transparency, accountability, and institutional responsibility that would influence how these later crises were handled. The trials also had a lasting impact on how we think about sports journalism and the responsibility of the media to investigate and report on problems within professional athletics. The scandal was broken not by sports reporters but by federal investigators, raising questions about whether the baseball press had been too close to the players and organizations they covered to maintain the critical distance necessary for effective oversight. In the years since the trials, sports journalism has evolved in ways that reflect lessons learned from the Pittsburgh scandal and others like it. There is greater emphasis on investigative reporting, more willingness to challenge official narratives, and more recognition that the public interest sometimes requires revealing uncomfortable truths about popular figures and institutions. This evolution has not been without controversy. Some argue that modern sports journalism has become too cynical, too quick to assume the worst about athletes and organizations, too focused on scandal at the expense of the joy and inspiration that sports can provide. But the Pittsburgh drug trials demonstrated the dangers of the opposite extreme, of a sports culture that was so protective of its heroes that it was willing to ignore serious problems that threatened both the integrity of competition and the welfare of athletes. Finding the right balance between celebration and scrutiny remains an ongoing challenge for sports media, just as finding the right balance between supporting athletes and holding them accountable remains a challenge for fans, officials, and the athletes themselves. The Pittsburgh drug trials also highlighted the importance of context in understanding and addressing problems within professional sports. The cocaine epidemic that swept through baseball in the early 1980s did not occur in a vacuum. It was part of a broader cultural phenomenon that affected all levels of American society. The pressures that led athletes to use drugs were not fundamentally different from the pressures that led other high-performing professionals to make similar choices. This recognition has important implications for how we think about preventing and addressing similar problems in the future. Solutions that focus only on punishment and enforcement, without addressing the underlying pressures and support systems that contribute to drug abuse, are likely to be incomplete and ineffective. The most successful interventions are those that combine accountability with compassion, that recognize both the need to maintain standards and the importance of helping people when they fail to meet those standards. The Pittsburgh drug trials were, in many ways, a case study in how not to handle a crisis of this magnitude. The problem was allowed to fester for years, while officials looked the other way, and when it finally came to light, the response was reactive rather than proactive, focused more on damage control than on addressing root causes. The legal proceedings were necessary and appropriate, but they came only after the damage had been done, after careers had been destroyed and lives had been lost. The lesson for future generations is clear. Prevention is always preferable to punishment, Early intervention is always more effective than late response, and institutional leadership requires the courage to confront uncomfortable truths, even when it would be easier to look away. As we close this examination of the Pittsburgh drug trials, it is worth remembering that this was not just a story about drugs or crime or scandal. It was a story about human beings struggling with problems that were larger than themselves, about institutions failing to live up to their responsibilities, about a society grappling with changes that challenged its most cherished assumptions. The men who found themselves in that Pittsburgh courtroom in the autumn of 1985 were not villains in any simple sense. They were people who had made bad choices, people who had been overwhelmed by pressures and temptations that they were not equipped to handle, people who had lost their way in a world that offered few clear guideposts for navigating the intersection of fame, money, and personal responsibility. Their stories remind us that the line between hero and human is often thinner than we want to believe, that the institutions we trust to protect us are only as strong as the people who run them, and that the price of maintaining our most cherished illusions is sometimes the very truth that could help us address our most serious problems. The Pittsburgh drug trials were a moment of reckoning for baseball, a time when the sport was forced to confront the gap between its public image and its private reality. That reckoning was painful, but it was also necessary, because it cleared the way for more honest conversations about the challenges facing modern athletics and the responsibilities that come with the privilege of entertaining and inspiring others. The trials did not solve all of baseball's problems. No single event could have done that. But they established important precedents about the need for transparency, accountability, and institutional responsibility that continue to influence how the sport handles crises today. They also provided valuable lessons about the human cost of scandal and the importance of providing support for people who are struggling with addiction and other personal challenges. Most importantly, perhaps, the Pittsburgh drug trials reminded us that baseball, like all human institutions, is fallible, that the people who play and run the game are capable of making serious mistakes, and that the only way to maintain the integrity of something we love is to be willing to acknowledge and address its flaws honestly and directly. That lesson extends far beyond baseball, far beyond sports, into every aspect of our collective life. It speaks to the fundamental tension between the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and the sometimes messier reality of who we actually become when faced with pressure, temptation, and the weight of other people's expectations. The courtroom in Pittsburgh, where these trials unfolded, was not just a place where justice was administered. It was a theater where America's relationship with its heroes was fundamentally redefined. Every piece of testimony, every admission of guilt, every moment of cross-examination chipped away at the comfortable fiction that athletic excellence somehow immunized people against human weakness. What emerged from those proceedings was not cynicism, but something more valuable. The recognition that true heroism might lie not in the absence of failure, but in the courage to confront failure honestly and to work toward something better. Consider the weight that settled on Keith Hernandez's shoulders as he sat in that witness chair, describing his 3-year relationship with cocaine to a room full of strangers, reporters, and federal prosecutors. Here was a man who had built his reputation on precision, the way he could turn a double play, the way he could read a pitcher's intent, the way he could place a ball exactly where he wanted it to go. Now he was being asked to apply that same precision to the messiest, most shameful period of his life, to dissect his own weakness with the same clinical accuracy he had once applied to opposing hitters. The irony was not lost on anyone in that courtroom. Baseball had always been a game of statistics, of measurable achievements that could be compared across generations and used to determine relative greatness. But there was no statistic for the number of times a player had compromised his principles, no box score entry for the moments when talent had been overshadowed by addiction, no way to quantify the distance between who someone was supposed to be and who they had actually become. Hernandez's estimate that 40% of major league players were using cocaine in the early 1980s, an estimate he would later try to retract, hung in the air like a confession of collective failure. If true, it meant that nearly half of the men charged with embodying America's ideals of fair play and healthy competition were secretly engaged in activities that undermined everything the game was supposed to represent. If false, it raised equally troubling questions about why someone would make such a claim under oath, and what that said about the culture of fear and paranoia that had taken root in major league clubhouses. The truth, as is often the case, probably lay somewhere between the extremes. Some players were deeply involved with drugs, others experimented occasionally, and still others managed to avoid the temptation entirely. But the exact numbers mattered less than the broader picture that emerged from the testimonies. Baseball in the early 1980s was a sport that had lost its way, where the pressures of performance and the availability of performance-altering substances had created an environment where poor choices seemed not just possible, but almost inevitable. Tim Raines's admission that he kept cocaine in his uniform pocket during games, that he slid headfirst into bases to protect the vial of drugs he carried with him, transformed one of baseball's most joyful acts, the stolen base, into something darker and more complicated. Every time fans had watched Raines take his lead off first base, every time they had held their breath as he broke for second, every time they had cheered his successful theft, they had been unknowingly celebrating a performance that was inextricably linked to the very substance that was destroying the game's integrity. The image is almost too painful to contemplate. A man whose natural speed and instinct had made him one of the most exciting players in baseball, reducing himself to a drug mule, carrying his addiction with him as he performed the very acts that had made him famous. It was a perversion of everything that made baseball beautiful, a corruption of the pure athletic joy that was supposed to be at the heart of the game. And yet, there was something almost heroic about Raines's willingness to admit this publicly, to acknowledge the full extent of his problem even when doing so would inevitably change how his career was remembered. It would have been easier to minimize his involvement, to claim that the drugs had not affected his performance, to maintain the fiction that he had been clean during the games that had made him a star. Instead, he chose honesty, even when honesty was humiliating. The testimonies revealed a world where the normal boundaries between public and private life had been completely erased. Rod Scurry, leaving the stadium during a game to search for cocaine, was not just a personal failure. It was an abandonment of his teammates, his fans, and his responsibilities as a professional athlete. It represented the moment when addiction became more powerful than any sense of duty or loyalty, when the need for drugs overwhelmed even the most basic professional obligations. Scurry's story was perhaps the most tragic of all the narratives that emerged from the trials, because it illustrated so clearly how quickly a promising career could be derailed by poor choices. He had been a talented pitcher with a devastating curveball, the kind of player who could change the outcome of games with a single pitch. But by the time of the trials, his talent had been overshadowed by his addiction, and his potential had been squandered in pursuit of highs that promised everything and delivered nothing but destruction. The fact that Scurry would die of a cocaine-related heart attack just 7 years after the trials served as a grim reminder that the legal proceedings had not solved the underlying problems that had led to the scandal in the first place. The courts could punish the dealers, the commissioner could suspend the players, the media could expose the extent of the problem, but none of that could undo the damage that had already been done to the people who had been caught up in the web of addiction and enablement. John Milner's revelation about finding liquid amphetamines in Willie Mays's locker created one of the most shocking moments of the entire proceedings, not because it implicated the Say Hey kid in drug use. Milner was careful to note that he had never seen Mays actually consume the substance, but because it suggested that performance-enhancing drugs had been present in major league clubhouses for decades, long before anyone had begun to pay serious attention to the problem. The image of Milner, then a young player trying to establish himself in the major leagues, discovering this cache of liquid amphetamines in the locker of one of the game's greatest heroes, speaks to the complex mentorship relationships that existed within baseball clubhouses. Players learned not just how to hit and field and pitch from their veteran teammates, but also how to navigate the less visible aspects of professional athletics. The shortcuts, the enhancements, the little compromises that seem to make the difference between success and failure. That Mays was never accused of actively distributing drugs or encouraging their use made the revelation even more troubling in some ways, because it suggested a culture of casual acceptance around performance enhancement that went far beyond any individual's choices. If substances like liquid amphetamines were present in the lockers of the game's most respected players, it implied a level of institutional tolerance that made more serious problems almost inevitable. Dale Barra's testimony about receiving amphetamines from Willie Stargell and Bill Madlock added another layer to this picture of pervasive drug use within the Pirates organization. Stargell, in particular, had been one of the most beloved figures in Pittsburgh sports history, a co-MVP of the 1979 World Series championship team, whose leadership and charisma had helped define an era of Pirates baseball. To learn that he had been distributing amphetamines to younger players was to discover that even the most admired figures in the game had been participating in activities that called their integrity into question. The defense strategy employed by Adam Renfro and the other attorneys representing the accused dealers was both clever and deeply cynical. By portraying their clients as victims of celebrity culture, as ordinary fans who had been corrupted by their proximity to fame and fortune, they were attempting to shift blame from the dealers to the players, from the suppliers to the users. It was an argument that had some merit. Certainly the players bore responsibility for their choices to use drugs, but it also ignored the reality that the dealers had actively participated in and profited from the corruption of professional athletics. Renfro's characterization of the testifying players as hero criminals was particularly pointed, because it highlighted the contradiction at the heart of the entire scandal. These were men who were simultaneously being celebrated for their athletic achievements and condemned for their personal failures. They were heroes on the field and criminals in the courtroom, champions in the record books and addicts in their private lives. The phrase also captured something essential about American culture's relationship with celebrity, the way that fame can both elevate and isolate, the way that public adulation can create private pressures that are almost impossible to bear. The players who found themselves testifying in Pittsburgh had achieved the American dream in its most visible form. They were wealthy, famous, and admired by millions. But they had also discovered that the dream could become a nightmare when the pressures of maintaining perfection became too great to bear. Curtis Strong, the Philadelphia caterer who emerged as the central figure in the prosecution's case, represented a different kind of corruption, one that was perhaps more troubling because it was so calculated and deliberate. Strong was not a fan who had been gradually drawn into illegal activity through his admiration for players. He was a businessman who had identified a market opportunity and had systematically exploited it for financial gain. Strong's access to major league clubhouses through his catering work had given him the perfect cover for his drug distribution activities. He could move freely through restricted areas, interact with players without arousing suspicion, and use his legitimate business relationships to mask his illegal ones. It was a sophisticated operation that demonstrated how vulnerable professional sports organizations were to individuals who were willing to abuse positions of trust for personal gain. The prosecution's decision to focus on Strong as the primary defendant was strategically sound, because it allowed them to present a clear narrative about outside corruption infiltrating the pure world of baseball. But it also obscured some of the more complex questions about institutional responsibility and the role that baseball itself had played in creating an environment where such corruption could flourish. Robert "Rav" McHugh represented yet another variation on the theme of opportunistic corruption. Unlike Strong, who had legitimate reasons to be in and around major league facilities, McHugh seems to have gained access to players through pure networking and persistence. He was a former Easter Seal Society employee who had somehow managed to insert himself into the social circles that surrounded the Pittsburgh Pirates, and who had parlayed those relationships into a profitable drug distribution business. McHugh's story illustrated how porous the boundaries around professional athletics had become, how easily someone with the right combination of charm, persistence, and product could gain access to players who should have been protected from such influences. It also highlighted the responsibility that players bore for vetting the people they allowed into their lives, and the consequences that could follow when they failed to exercise appropriate judgment about their associations. The fact that McHugh was ultimately convicted on 7 counts of cocaine distribution demonstrated that the legal system took seriously the threat that such individuals posed to the integrity of professional sports. But his conviction also raised questions about why it had taken so long for authorities to identify and prosecute him, and what that said about the oversight and security measures that were supposed to protect players from exploitation. Dale Schiffman's role in the scandal was perhaps the most complex and morally ambiguous of all. Unlike Strong or McHugh, Schiffman had not set out to become a drug dealer. He had simply been a photographer who loved baseball and who had been granted unusual access to his heroes. His transformation from fan to dealer seemed to happen gradually, almost imperceptibly, as small favors for players evolved into a more systematic business relationship. Schiffman's later description of how his involvement began: "It was one of those deals where they'd say, 'Hey man, can you get us some Coke?' So I just started checking around, and before I knew it, things went from 0 to 60 real quick." Captures the almost casual way that serious crimes can evolve from innocent interactions. There was no dramatic moment of decision, no clear point at which Schiffman chose to become a criminal. Instead, there was a series of small choices, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, that collectively led him down a path he had never intended to travel. The friendship between Schiffman and Kevin Koch added another layer of tragedy to the entire story. These were 2 men who had grown up together, who had shared a love of baseball and of each other's company, who had found themselves living out a fantasy of proximity to their heroes. But that fantasy had gradually transformed into a nightmare, as their access to players created opportunities for illegal activity, and their illegal activity created pressures that ultimately destroyed their friendship. Koch's decision to cooperate with federal authorities by wearing a wire to record conversations with Schiffman was undoubtedly the right choice from a legal standpoint. It allowed him to avoid serious criminal charges and helped authorities build their case against other defendants. But it was also a betrayal of a friendship that had lasted since childhood, and the emotional cost of that betrayal must have been enormous for both men. The image of Koch, the man who had entertained thousands of children as the pirate parrot, sitting in a parking lot while FBI agents strapped recording equipment to his chest, preparing to betray his oldest friend in order to save himself, encapsulates much of what was tragic about the entire scandal. These were not hardened criminals or career drug dealers. They were ordinary people who had made extraordinary mistakes and who were now being forced to make impossible choices about loyalty, friendship, and personal survival. The trials themselves were a media sensation, drawing national attention to Pittsburgh and casting an unwelcome spotlight on a city that was already struggling with economic decline and social change. For a community that had taken pride in its sports teams as symbols of resilience and working-class values, the revelation that the pirates had been deeply involved in drug trafficking was particularly painful. The daily coverage of the proceedings, with its detailed accounts of drug transactions and player testimonies, stripped away much of the mystique that had surrounded professional baseball. Fans who had grown up believing that their heroes were fundamentally different from ordinary people, stronger, more disciplined, more moral, were forced to confront evidence that athletes were just as vulnerable to temptation and weakness as anyone else. This loss of innocence was not confined to Pittsburgh, or even to baseball. The trials occurred during a period when American society was beginning to grapple seriously with drug abuse as a widespread social problem, when the war on drugs was reshaping law enforcement priorities and social policies. The sight of famous athletes admitting to drug use under oath served as a powerful reminder that addiction did not respect fame, fortune, or social status. The trials also highlighted the inadequacy of existing institutional responses to drug abuse. Major League Baseball's policies regarding drug use were vague and rarely enforced. Drug testing was non-existent, and there were few resources available to help players who might be struggling with addiction. The sport had essentially relied on the honor system and the assumption that players would police themselves, an approach that had clearly failed. Commissioner Peter Ueberroth's response to the crisis was both decisive and controversial. His decision to suspend 11 players, even though their suspensions were ultimately commuted, sent a clear message that drug use would not be tolerated in baseball. But his decision to commute those suspensions in exchange for fines, community service, and drug testing suggested that the sport was more interested in rehabilitation than punishment. The compromise satisfied no one completely. Those who wanted harsher penalties argued that the commuted suspensions sent the wrong message about the seriousness of drug use. Those who favored a more compassionate approach argued that even the original suspensions were too harsh for players who had already suffered public humiliation and who were struggling with addiction. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Ueberroth's response was his recognition that the problem extended beyond individual players to the institutional culture of baseball itself. The drug testing requirements, educational programs, and policy changes that followed the trials represented an acknowledgement that preventing future scandals would require systematic changes to how the sport was administered and how players were supported. The long-term impact of the Pittsburgh drug trials on the careers of the players involved varied significantly. Some, like Dave Parker and Keith Hernandez, were able to rebuild their reputations and achieve new levels of success. Parker's selection to multiple All-Star teams after the scandal and his eventual induction into the Hall of Fame demonstrated that redemption was possible for players who were willing to learn from their mistakes and work to rebuild their careers. Hernandez's continued excellence as a defensive first baseman and his role in the New York Mets' 1986 World Championship showed that past drug use did not necessarily preclude future achievement. His willingness to speak openly about his experiences with cocaine and his efforts to educate others about the dangers of addiction helped to transform his image from that of a fallen hero to that of a cautionary tale with a positive message. Lonnie Smith's selection as National League Comeback Player of the Year in 1989 provided another example of how players could recover from the scandal and achieve new success. Smith's career trajectory after the trials demonstrated that the stigma associated with drug use was not necessarily permanent, and that players who were willing to confront their problems honestly could find new opportunities for achievement. But the positive outcomes experienced by some players should not obscure the more tragic consequences that befell others. Rod Scurry's death from a cocaine-related heart attack in 1992 served as a stark reminder that the legal resolution of the scandal had not solved the underlying problems that had led to it. Willie Akins's subsequent conviction for selling crack cocaine and his 20-year prison sentence showed how drug abuse could continue to destroy lives even after the initial scandal had faded from public memory. Alan Wiggins's death from HIV-related complications in 1991, after contracting the virus through intravenous drug use, provided another tragic example of how addiction could lead to consequences that extended far beyond career damage or public embarrassment. These deaths served as sobering reminders that the Pittsburgh drug trials were not just about baseball, or even just about drugs. They were about human lives that had been derailed by poor choices and inadequate support systems. The differential outcomes experienced by the players involved in the scandal highlighted the importance of access to resources, support systems, and second chances. Those players who were able to recover successfully generally had strong family support, financial resources that allowed them to seek treatment, and teams that were willing to give them opportunities to rebuild their careers. Those who struggled continued to face challenges that extended far beyond anything that could be addressed through legal or administrative measures. The trials also had a lasting impact on baseball's approach to drug testing and player support. The random drug testing requirements that were imposed on the suspended players represented baseball's first serious attempt to monitor drug use systematically, and they served as a precursor to the more comprehensive testing programs that would be implemented in later decades. The educational programs and support services that were developed in response to the scandal helped to establish new norms around player welfare and institutional responsibility. While these programs were imperfect and limited in scope, they represented a recognition that preventing drug abuse required more than just punishment and testing. It required a comprehensive approach that addressed the underlying pressures and risk factors that contributed to addiction. The community service requirements that were imposed on the suspended players also served an important function, both as punishment and as opportunity for redemption. By requiring players to work directly with drug abuse prevention programs, baseball ensured that they would contribute to efforts to address the problem they had helped to create. Some players embraced these opportunities and became effective advocates for drug abuse prevention, while others fulfilled their obligations more reluctantly. The Pittsburgh drug trials also marked a turning point in sports journalism's approach to covering professional athletics. The scandal had been broken not by baseball reporters, but by federal investigators, raising questions about whether the sports press had been too deferential to players and organizations to maintain the critical distance necessary for effective oversight. In the years following the trials, there was increased emphasis on investigative reporting within sports journalism, more willingness to pursue uncomfortable stories about drug use and other problems within professional athletics, and greater recognition that the public interest sometimes required reporting that might damage the reputation of popular figures and institutions. This evolution was not without controversy. Some argued that the increased scrutiny had gone too far, that sports journalists had become too cynical and too quick to assume the worst about athletes and organizations. Others maintained that the Pittsburgh scandal had demonstrated the dangers of sports journalism that was too close to its subjects, and that increased skepticism was necessary to prevent future scandals from developing unchecked. The debate over the appropriate relationship between sports journalists and the athletes and organizations they cover continues to this day, and it reflects broader questions about the role of media in a democratic society. The Pittsburgh drug trials served as a case study in what could go wrong when institutional oversight failed, and they highlighted the importance of maintaining independent, critical perspectives on powerful institutions and public figures. The trials also had implications for how we think about the relationship between performance enhancement and competitive integrity in professional sports. While the cocaine use that was revealed in the trials was not primarily motivated by a desire to enhance athletic performance, most of the players involved seemed to be using drugs recreationally rather than strategically. The scandal raised important questions about what constitutes fair competition and how to maintain level playing fields in professional athletics. The revelation that amphetamines had been widely used in major league clubhouses for decades suggested that performance enhancement had been a part of baseball culture long before anyone had begun to pay serious attention to the problem. The casual way that players described obtaining and using greenies indicated that there had been widespread acceptance of certain types of performance enhancement, even as other substances were considered taboo. This history would become particularly relevant during the steroid era that would engulf baseball in the 1990s and 2000s. The Pittsburgh drug trials served as an early warning about baseball's vulnerability to performance-enhancing drugs, and they demonstrated the consequences that could follow when the sport failed to establish clear policies and enforcement mechanisms around drug use. The trials also illustrated the complex relationship between addiction and performance in professional athletics. While recreational drug use typically impairs, rather than enhances athletic performance, the psychological effects of addiction can be just as damaging to competitive integrity as the physiological effects of performance-enhancing drugs. Players who are preoccupied with obtaining and using drugs cannot devote their full attention to their athletic responsibilities, and their compromised judgment can affect not just their own performance but the performance of their teammates as well. The recognition that drug abuse could undermine competitive integrity even when the drugs themselves were not performance-enhancing helped to broaden the conversation about what it means to maintain fair competition in professional sports. It also highlighted the importance of addressing drug abuse, not just as a public health issue, but as a sports integrity issue that could affect the fundamental fairness of athletic competition. As we reflect on the Pittsburgh drug trials from the perspective of 2025, it is clear that many of the lessons learned from that scandal remain relevant today. The pressures that led athletes to use drugs in the 1980s, the demand for peak performance, the availability of substances that promise to help achieve that performance, the isolation that can come with fame and success, continue to challenge professional athletes across all sports. The institutional failures that allowed the scandal to develop, inadequate oversight, unclear policies, insufficient support for athletes struggling with personal problems, also remain relevant, even as sports organizations have implemented more sophisticated systems for monitoring and addressing drug use. The fundamental challenge of balancing competitive integrity with athlete welfare, of maintaining high standards while providing compassionate support for those who fail to meet those standards, continues to face every major sports organization. Perhaps most importantly, the Pittsburgh drug trials demonstrated the human cost of institutional failure and the importance of maintaining vigilance against the corrupting influences that can undermine even the most cherished institutions. The players, dealers, and other individuals who were caught up in the scandal were not evil people. They were people who had made bad choices, who had been overwhelmed by pressures they were not equipped to handle, who had found themselves in situations where their judgment had been compromised by addiction, ambition, or simple human weakness. Their stories serve as reminders that maintaining the integrity of the institutions we value requires constant attention and commitment, that problems rarely announce themselves with fanfare, but instead develop gradually in the shadows, and that the price of ignoring warning signs can be catastrophic for both individuals and institutions. The trials also reminded us that redemption is possible, that people who have made serious mistakes can learn from those mistakes and go on to contribute positively to society. The players who successfully rebuilt their careers after the scandal, the dealers who found new purposes in helping others avoid similar mistakes, and the institutions that implemented meaningful reforms in response to the crisis all demonstrated that failure does not have to be final, that learning and growth can emerge from even the darkest chapters in our personal and collective histories. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Pittsburgh drug trials is the importance of honesty. Honesty about our failings, honesty about our weaknesses, honesty about the gap between our aspirations and our achievements. The players who testified in those Pittsburgh courtrooms could have chosen to remain silent, to protect their reputations at the expense of justice. Instead, they chose to tell the truth, even when that truth was painful and embarrassing and potentially damaging to everything they had worked to build. That choice, to prioritize truth over reputation, justice over self-interest, collective welfare over individual protection, may have been the most heroic act of their entire careers. It was not the kind of heroism that gets remembered in record books or celebrated in highlight reels, but it was the kind of heroism that actually matters, the kind that makes positive change possible and helps to ensure that future generations can learn from the mistakes of the past. The Pittsburgh drug trials were not just a baseball story or even just a sports story. They were an American story, a reflection of our ongoing struggle to reconcile our ideals with our reality, our heroes with our humanity, our aspirations with our limitations. They revealed uncomfortable truths about the institutions we cherish and the people we admire, but they also demonstrated our capacity for growth, learning, and redemption. In the end, that may be the most important legacy of the Pittsburgh drug trials. Not the scandal itself, but the response to it. Not the failures that were revealed, but the reforms that followed. Not the heroes who fell, but the humanity that was ultimately acknowledged and addressed. The trials forced us to confront the reality that our heroes are human beings, with all the vulnerabilities and weaknesses that humanity entails, and to recognize that true heroism lies not in the absence of failure, but in the courage to confront failure honestly and to work toward something better. And in that recognition, perhaps, lies hope for all of us. Hope that our own failures need not define us, that our institutions can learn and grow, and that the stories we tell about ourselves can become more honest, more compassionate, and ultimately more true to the complex realities of human experience. The Pittsburgh drug trials were a reckoning, but they were also a beginning, the beginning of a more mature, more honest conversation about what it means to be human in the public eye, and what it takes to maintain the integrity of the things we love most. The echoes of those trials continue to reverberate today, in every drug test administered, in every policy implemented, in every moment when someone chooses honesty over convenience, truth over comfort, growth over stagnation. They remind us that the price of preserving what we cherish is eternal vigilance, and that the courage to confront uncomfortable truths is the foundation of all lasting reform. In the soft light of memory, the Pittsburgh drug trials emerge not as a simple story of good versus evil, but as a complex meditation on human nature, institutional responsibility, and the ongoing challenge of living up to our highest aspirations. They were a moment when the curtain was pulled back to reveal the machinery behind the magic, when the gap between mythology and reality was exposed for all to see, when America was forced to reckon with the fact that even its most beloved institutions were vulnerable to the same weaknesses that afflict all human endeavors. But they were also a moment of possibility, a time when the acknowledgement of failure created space for genuine reform, when the courage to tell the truth opened the door to meaningful change, when the painful process of confronting reality created opportunities for growth that had not existed before. That, perhaps, is the real legacy of the Pittsburgh drug trials. Not the scandals they revealed, but the conversations they started. Not the careers they damaged, but the reforms they inspired. Not the innocence they destroyed, but the wisdom they helped to create. They were a turning point disguised as an ending, a beginning that looked like a conclusion, a moment of hope that emerged from the depths of despair. And in that contradiction, in that complex interplay of loss and discovery, failure and growth, destruction and renewal, we find something essentially American, something that speaks to our national character and our ongoing struggle to create institutions worthy of our highest aspirations. The Pittsburgh drug trials were not just about baseball. They were about us, about who we are and who we aspire to be, about the distance between our dreams and our reality, and about the courage required to close that gap one honest conversation at a time. The story ends, as all great stories do, not with easy answers but with deeper questions, not with simple resolutions but with ongoing challenges, not with closure but with the recognition that the work of building and maintaining integrity is never finished, that the price of preserving what we love is constant vigilance, and that the courage to confront uncomfortable truths is the foundation of all lasting change. In the gathering dusk of memory, the Pittsburgh drug trials stand as a monument to both human frailty and human resilience, a reminder that even our most cherished institutions are only as strong as the people who comprise them, and that the health of those institutions depends not on the absence of problems, but on the presence of the courage to acknowledge and address problems when they arise. The trials were a moment of truth for baseball, for Pittsburgh, for America. A time when we were forced to look honestly at ourselves and to confront the gap between who we claimed to be and who we actually were. The vision that emerged from that confrontation was not always pretty, but it was real, and in that reality lay the foundation for something better, something more honest, something more true to the complex realities of human experience. And so the story of the Pittsburgh drug trials becomes, ultimately, a story about the possibility of redemption, about the power of truth to transform even the darkest situations, about the capacity of human beings and human institutions to learn from their failures and to grow stronger through the process of confronting their weaknesses. It is a story that reminds us that heroism is not about perfection, but about the courage to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep growing, even when, especially when, the costs of growth are high and the path forward is unclear. In that courage, in that commitment to growth and learning and honest self-examination, lies the true legacy of the Pittsburgh drug trials, and the real hope for all of us who continue to struggle with the challenge of living up to our highest aspirations in a world that often seems designed to test our resolve. The trials taught us that failure is not the end of the story. It is simply the beginning of the next chapter, the first step toward whatever redemption we might be brave enough to seek.